I am 80 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned in all this time, it's that life doesn't usually warn you when it's about to surprise you. It just appears, like a rainy afternoon in Charleston that no one predicted, soaking the asphalt and making the world seem new and frightening all at once. I've lived here in the Harleston Village neighborhood for over 40 years, in this same house with a colonial roof, with the backyard where my children grew up and where Helen planted a jabuticaba tree that to this day insists on bearing fruit every September. I tend to this backyard as if caring for it were a way to keep talking to her. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. My routine, if I can call it that, always starts the same way. I wake up before sunrise, sit on the edge of the bed for a time I can't quite measure, not because I'm tired, but because the silence of the room still weighs in a way that needs to be traversed slowly. Then I go to the kitchen, put water on to boil, and make my coffee. For many years, I made two. Today, I make one. This detail seems small to an outsider. To me, it's the first moment of the day when I feel the magnitude of the space that absence occupies. My name is Frederick Andrade Mouron. I worked for over 30 years as a civil engineer here in South Carolina, helping to build bridges, overpasses, buildings that are still standing today. I was always very proud of that. Building things to last was a kind of life philosophy. Ironically, the structures that mattered most in my private life were the ones I paid the least attention to. I have two children. Camilla, the eldest, lives in Mount Pleasant, 20 minutes from here. She's a doctor, a strong, determined woman with her mother's generous smile and a stubbornness that, to be honest, I must admit she inherited from me. She calls every week, visits when she can, and I always feel lighter after she leaves, even missing her before she even reaches the gate. And then there's Edward, my youngest son. Edward vanished from my life 15 years ago after an argument that I, at the time, thought was about money, about inheritances, about the disagreements that sometimes grow between parents and children until they become too big to ignore. He left for Miami, Florida, without looking back, and the silence he left behind was different from all the others, heavier, with a bitter taste that I swallowed alone for years. That Tuesday morning, everything was as expected. I had watered the jabuticaba tree, had my coffee, read the printed newspaper that the neighborhood boy still brings me every morning, and was sitting on the porch watching a pigeon stroll along the wall as if it owned the place when the phone rang. It was Camilla. She didn't say hello. She said with that voice she inherited from her mother when something serious is on the tip of her tongue, "Dad, you need to be prepared for what I'm about to tell you." I felt my heart clench with a force I no longer expected to feel at this age. I breathed, and she continued. Edward had called her the night before. He was in Charleston. He had driven from Miami without telling anyone and wanted to see me, not just to see me. He wanted to talk. And from the words he used with Camilla, she understood it wasn't a courtesy visit. It was a visit to settle accounts. Or perhaps. And Camilla paused for a moment before saying to gather courage. I stayed quiet for a time that must have seemed long on the other end of the line. The porch remained the same. The pigeon continued walking along the wall. The sun continued beating down on the garage roof as if the world hadn't just turned upside down inside an old man's chest. "When is he coming?" I asked. "This afternoon," she said, and I could hear in the few inches of silence between her words how apprehensive she also was. I spent the rest of the morning tidying the house, as if I could also organize what I was feeling. I washed cups that didn't need washing. I folded dish towels that were already folded. I sat on the living room sofa and looked at the photograph that still sits on the wooden bookshelf. Helen and I at our silver wedding anniversary party. She with that wide smile that filled her entire face. I with my usual serious expression, but with eyes shining in a way I couldn't fake. Beside that photo, there's another, smaller one, of the two children still young. Edward hugging Camilla on the backyard stairs, on a Sunday whose date I no longer remember, but which was preserved in that rectangle of paper forever. I went to the bedroom, opened the dresser drawer, and took out a letter. It was inside a yellowed envelope that I had never thrown away, even knowing that the day I would have to use it would eventually come. Helen wrote this letter in the last months of her life, when she already knew that time was becoming shorter than any of us would like to accept. She asked me to keep it, not to read it until it was necessary. She said I would know the right time. I held the envelope in my hands for a long moment. I felt the weight of the paper, which is always less than the weight of what is written inside it. Then I put it back in the drawer. It wasn't time yet. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the intercom rang. I walked to the gate with the firmest step I could muster. I opened the electronic gate and waited. And then I saw him. Edward. 52 years old, with graying hair at his temples, his face showing the marks of the years, but still with that dark, intense gaze that always reminded me of myself when I was younger. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking at me as if unsure whether to cross or retreat. I took the first step. It had always been me who took the first step, even when I didn't know where I was going. "Edward," I said, and my voice came out older than I expected. He swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and replied simply, "Dad, I had to come. There's something I found out, and it changes everything." There are moments in life that we carry for entire decades without realizing how much they weigh, until someone places them on the table between the two of you, and suddenly the air in the room feels denser, as if the pressure has increased. It was exactly like that when Edward and I sat in the living room of the house where he grew up, with the Charleston afternoon slowly descending beyond the windows and the jabuticaba tree in the backyard swaying gently in the wind. He looked at his hands as he spoke. It was a habit I recognized, because it was my way too when I wasn't quite sure how to look directly at what I was saying. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We're continuing. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. "I went for a health screening last year," he began. "One of those you do to find out about genetic predispositions. And when the results came back..." He stopped, breathed. "Dad, the test indicated an incompatibility. I dug deeper. I did other tests, consulted doctors, and the conclusion was always the same." I knew what was coming even before he finished the sentence. I had known for 52 years, and when I heard the words coming out of my son's mouth, I felt not a shock, but a kind of painful relief, like when a pressure you've learned to carry finally finds a place to rest. "I'm not your biological son," he said, and his voice trembled only at the end, in that space where words meet the emotions we try to contain. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Edward looked up and gazed at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. It was a mixture of pain, old anger, and something that looked like a plea disguised as an accusation. He wanted me to fall apart. He wanted it to be a revelation that would catch me by surprise, that would justify all the years of distance between us as a consequence of something I never knew, but that would now change everything. But I didn't fall apart, because it wasn't a surprise. "I know, Edward," I said, my voice so low that for a second I thought he hadn't heard. He froze. "What?" "I've known for over 50 years. The silence that settled this time was different. It was a silence that thought, that processed, that sought structure where the ground had suddenly vanished. He stood up from the chair, took 2 steps towards the window, and stood with his back to me for a time I couldn't measure. "You knew and never told me anything?" "No." "Why?" And then it was my turn to need a moment. I slowly stood up, went to the bedroom, opened the dresser drawer, and returned with the yellowed envelope I had kept for all these years. I placed it on the coffee table between the two of us, like someone placing their heart where before there had only been distance. "Your mother wrote this for you," I said. "She asked me to keep it until it was necessary. I think the time has come." Edward looked at the envelope like someone looking at something that frightens and attracts at the same time. He remained still for an instant. Then he slowly bent down, took the envelope with both hands, and opened it with a care that broke me inside, because it was the same care a son has for the memory of his mother that he still carried in everything he did, even without realizing it. I didn't need to read it. I knew what was written, because Helen had told me everything before putting it on paper. She had told me on a Saturday afternoon in Beaufort, when we went to spend the weekend to celebrate our 20th anniversary, and she said she couldn't go on with the peace she deserved without telling me the truth. She had had a brief relationship before our marriage was officially registered at the registry office, a mistake born of loneliness and youth, and when she found out she was expecting Edward, she was already married to me and couldn't be sure. She told me crying, expecting me to pull away, to become someone else. But I didn't pull away, because I already loved that boy who hadn't even been born yet, and because I loved Helen in a way that couldn't be contained by demands. We decided together not to tell anyone, not out of cowardice, out of love, so that Edward could grow up whole, without the weight of a story that wasn't his fault. What I didn't foresee was that the distance that grew between Edward and me over the years, that coldness he felt, and that I never knew how to explain because I wasn't sure where it came from. Perhaps it was the unconscious weight of a secret that we both carried without knowing. Perhaps I had tried to protect him, in a way that, in practice, pushed him away. When Edward finished reading the letter, he remained quiet for a very long time. I watched him from a distance, sitting in the chair, with my hands clasped in my lap, waiting. Then he said, without lifting his eyes from the paper, "She writes here that you were the truest father I could have had, that you never asked about the past, that you never used it against her." "She didn't need to write that," I said, "but she always knew how to express herself better than I did." Edward slowly folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and finally lifted his eyes to me. They were the eyes of the boy who used to climb the jabuticaba tree and call me to see how high he had gotten. It was the same gaze, but with 52 years of life within it. "Why did you never try to tell me, Dad, when I grew up, when I became an adult?" "Because I would have also had to explain why I kept it. And I didn't want you to think that the love I felt was diminished by anything. It wasn't. Edward, it never was." He brought his hands to his face. His shoulders moved in a way I recognized, because it was the way my son always cried when he thought he couldn't, ever since he was little. And I stood up, crossed the room with the slowest and surest steps I had ever taken in my life, and placed my hand on his shoulder, as a father places his hand on his son when there are no more words that come close to what needs to be said. We stayed like that for a while. The sun finished setting on the other side of the window. The backyard darkened. The jabuticaba tree became just a familiar shadow against the wall. Camilla arrived later. She found the two of them in the kitchen, me making coffee, Edward sitting at the table with the envelope in front of him, and eyes red from having gone through something big. She understood without needing an explanation, because children sometimes understand what parents never said. She sat beside her brother, took his hand, and looked at me with a nod that was both a question and an answer. We served 3 cups, the first time in many years that my table had that precise number of people around it. That night, Edward slept in what had been his room. Before turning off the light, he came to my living room door and said, "Tomorrow morning, teach me how you take care of the jabuticaba tree." I said yes. And as he walked away down the hallway, I stood looking into the darkness with my heart doing a strange thing, something that took me a while to name. It was gratitude. Simple, unadorned, unexplained. The gratitude of an 80-year-old man who discovered once again that there is still time for the right things to arrive, sometimes in slow steps, sometimes by car from Miami, Florida, without warning.